Okay, great. So I'm going to try to provide some connection, and maybe, we started out with a down note because, frankly, this is a huge challenge, and I think we have to face it squarely, and we have to think about what we need to do as placemakers, especially, to deal with this challenge. And by the way, I'm from the United States also, Michael Mehaffy. I have a part-time appointment here at KTH, so I have a 1 foot in the U.S. as well, and also working internationally. And this is an international issue, an issue of globalization and an issue that exists in many other places. So although we started in the United States, we're really thinking about how this relates to other parts of the world, including Europe. So I'm going to touch on all that. And as I said, I'm going to try to make a connection between the gentrification challenge and what we as placemakers should be doing about the problem. And to put it bluntly, how much are we part of the solution and how much are we part of the problem? And that's something that I think we have to ask ourselves honestly. I'm going to quote from Peter's book, which is kind of what he alluded to, that gentrification is not a fluke. It's not simply, a million gentrifiers who all want to do the same thing. It actually is the result of some deliberate choices that were made, especially the choices of a few public intellectuals, politicians, planners, and so on. And he mentioned Richard Florida, and I could also add Edward Glaser as another person who has articulated this idea that we need to create these sort of nuclear reactors of cities that are going to give us these great economic benefits, and they're going to shower down to all of us. And that's very much the idea of the exploiting the agglomeration benefits of cities, which are very real. There's no question about it. But the question we have to ask is, if a little is good, is a lot always better? If I take 2 aspirins and that's twice as good as 1 aspirin, can I take 100 aspirins? Is that 100 times better? Well, clearly not. There are issues of scale and quality here, and we can't just continue to focus on the overheated cores of cities. And indeed, Richard Florida and Edward Glaser have both recognized some of the drawbacks of this kind of thinking and issued mea culpas, so to speak, about maybe we need to rethink what we're doing when we're focusing on, as Peter said, the capital side of the equation and overlooking the human side, because ultimately that's something that affects the capital side as well. It's unsustainable in the end. And that's a point that Jane Jacobs made. As many of you know, if you know Jane Jacobs' great work on economic development, on urban development, she argued for a kind of optimum of diversity, that was good for the bottom line in the long run, as well as good for justice and good for everybody. And that minimum wealth and minimum diversity was not good for cities in the form of slums, but neither was maximum wealth and with minimum diversity. Then you have an enclave, you have gentrification, and that's not good. So we need to aim for this kind of sweet spot on the Jacobs curve, if you will. And Jacobs also argued that we have to be careful because diversity will self-destruct if you don't stop it, if you don't resist it. So we need to create those breaks, those policies, those tools, those things that are going to make it possible for diversity to be maintained in this optimum state, and also to make sure that poverty is not the condition as well. So this is the kind of false dichotomy, I think, that you see in a place like New Orleans. Well, everybody's poor, so we have to gentrify. That's the only alternative. No, we need to aim for that optimum range. And in my own hometown of Portland, Oregon, we're having a similar debate right now. And there are people who want to over-focus on the wealthy cores of cities. And the result of that is lo and behold, gentrification, inequality, displacement, and other kinds of problems. And their solution to that is to just try to cram a bunch of new buildings into the core on the theory that if you meet demand with supply, price will go down. Well, of course, if the what you're supplying is very expensive high-rises, the price is not going to go down. You're going to fuel the problem that you're trying to solve. And that comes also from network theory, the idea that it's not just the core that matters. It's the entire network that generates benefits. And diversity is good for everybody's bottom line, including geographic diversity. And this idea of voodoo urbanism that, you've heard of voodoo economics, that you just focus on the wealthiest people at the top of the pyramid, and all the benefits are going to shower down to everybody else, trickle down. The same is true for this model of city making, that you just focus on the wealthy cores and you make sure that they get wealthier and wealthier, and that's going to trickle down to everybody else in the city. And that's what I call voodoo urbanism. And it's not economically sustainable, and as well as it's unjust. So as my friend Mike Batty said, we need to rethink this idea of the city as a network, as a diverse network, physically diverse as well as diverse in other ways, that has these interactions and flows. And we need to understand as placemakers that this is the system that we're working on when we're intervening. And again, this is what Jane Jacobs pointed out. Gentrification loses diversity and causes economic stagnation in the end. It's ultimately not sustainable. And she was not for preserving existing neighborhoods as gentrifying fossils. That's one of the criticisms. In fact, Ed Glazer has criticized her for that. But she said, don't simply cram new buildings into these places either and expect that, replacing all the old buildings with new buildings is going to do anything other than create another kind of gentrification. That's the voodoo urbanism that we need to resist. And so, along with other kinds of diversity that Jacobs advocated, like diversity of uses, kinds and ages and costs of buildings, pathways and destinations on small blocks, people mixed in concentrated areas in different parts of the city, and geographic diversity as well. And that's something that we are trying to do in Portland. We have a great regional plan called the 2040 growth concept that does have a polycentric form with lots of existing nodes that are we're intending to develop those as complete communities that people spend most of their time in. They come to the core maybe once a week or so. And the groovy core, though, is what you hear about Portland. And unfortunately, most of Portland is not that at all. 90% or so is a sprawling suburban region, just like every other part of the United States and many other parts of every other place in the world. So this is what you hear about Portland. What we like to tell everybody is what Portland is all about. And this is also what's going on in Portland. In fact, in a much larger area and over a much larger population. This very fragmented, monocultural, auto-dependent, very high greenhouse gas emissions per capita, and so on and so forth. So this is the challenge that, again, the United States is not the only place we should be talking about, but the United States, unfortunately, has been a major exporter of this model to the world. And so as we're thinking about the new urban agenda, which Tigran mentioned at the outset, which is a landmark document, I think, and it proclaims cities for all, the theme of our conference today. I think we can recognize these issues for us as placemakers, as people who are thinking about our tools and strategies, recognizing that we do have rapid urbanization, which in some cases is good news. It brings opportunities for better health, better human development, opportunities for women, and so on. But on the other hand, there are many alarming aspects of that because what is built is sprawling, resource inefficient, and dysfunctional in other ways, including it is now gentrifying. I can show you lots of examples, but this is Beijing, China. Over just 9 years, the extent of the city has multiplied fourfold in just 9 years. We are on track to produce more urban fabric in the next 40 years than we have in all of human history, and that's a staggering fact to think about, especially when we think about the quality of the urbanization, because on the one hand, we have the explosive growth of informal settlements, slums. About a quarter of the world's population by most measures lives in slums. And then the so-called market rate development, which is increasingly sprawling, auto-dependent, resource-dependent, and it's gentrifying and becoming very exclusive, segregated with gated communities and inward-turning shopping malls and all the rest of it. And in both of those cases, the model of urbanization is failing to provide what cities really can provide, which is human development. Instead, we're getting an unsustainable form of sprawl. We're getting both the sprawl in the suburbs and the gentrification, which is the other side of the coin, I would argue. So you can see this pattern right around the world in South America, in China, in India, in Eastern Europe, lots of countries all over the world. I did a little experiment recently where I took a McDonald's, not to pick on McDonald's, but they are a kind of indicator species, if you will, of this sprawling lifestyle, drive-through, high consumption, meat eating, and so on. This one happens to be in near the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And I was able to find new McDonald's on Flickr indeed in Brazil, in China, in India, and in Eastern Europe. And what you're seeing here is not just the new McDonald's, but all of the urbanism around it, which is new for the last 5 or 10 years or so, all drive-through, all sprawling, all, part of this high-consumption lifestyle. So this is the other side of the coin from the gentrification, or if you like, it's the companion of gentrification. We do need to recognize the urgent need to overcome poverty and its ills, but we need to find a viable alternative to this model, which you might think of as the crack cocaine of economic development. Sure, it creates a great high, a very quick high. You can understand why people in the developing world want it, but it's going to produce a planetary hangover. And again, it's a two-sided beast, if you will, sprawl in the periphery and gentrification in the core. So the new urban agenda really addresses these issues squarely, and there's language in there. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about it, but about well-connected cities, urban spatial frameworks that provide access for everybody, mobility, compactness, density, mixed use, walkable, and so on. Recognizing the agglomeration benefits, but also the idea of polycentrism as a way of overheating and avoiding overheating. And that, again, goes back to the kinds of things that Jane Jacobs talked about, the kind of problem a city is, that it is a form of organized complexity, and we as planners and architects and designers need to be thinking that way and thinking about how placemaking fits into that process and responds to these challenges. So on this concluding section, I want to try to provide at least the beginning of a model of a definition of placemaking that is a little more rigorous that maybe we can talk about. And this is a paper that Tigran Haas and I are working on right now as well. What is placemaking? How do we define it? How do we do it? Why does it matter? And to be blunt about it, how do we answer the charge that, well, you guys are just rearranging your plaza chairs on an urban Titanic? That's what sometimes the challenge to placemaking is. Or you're just fueling gentrification by making places nicer. We need to respond to those challenges and respond to the broader context, which I would put this way. What is it about cities that brings people to them? Why are we getting rapid urbanization? Why are we getting overheating? What is it that cities give us, and why do we build cities at all? We've only been doing it for about the last 10,000 years or so of human history, which is a small percentage of our history. So I'm going to just back up and talk a little bit of sort of big picture here, and then I'll drill down into some specifics. We're bringing ourselves together, obviously to create a kind of life, a culture, a polis, and so on. But we're also creating a lot of conflicts with one another, right? And so when we interact with each other, we potentially constrain each other's freedom to do what we want to do in that city, in that life. The structures we create limit the freedom of other people. So if I build a wall, it keeps you from crossing that wall. And as my friend Paul Moraine points out, the structure of the city, the physical structure and the legal and political system manifest that resolution of those interests and those conflicts. It's a mediation between the conflicting freedoms of the people, who are the agents of the city, interacting within the spatial networks of the city. So that's a kind of abstract statement, but I'll drill down into some more concrete examples. So if you think about what kind of freedoms we want in the city, and what kinds of freedoms can the city convey to me as a resident of the city? I can modulate my social interactions. I can be more in contact with other people or more private. I can walk to needs or choose other modes to get around. I can access employment and resource networks and so on. I can be stimulated and enjoy the beauty of the city. I can be free from danger and disruption. And those are the things that I can do. But if your freedom or my freedom conflicts with your freedom, for example, you want to party until 3 a.m. and I want to be free to sleep, right? So one way to resolve that issue is simply to segregate our residences if we have a conflict. So you put your home way over there, I put my home way over here, problem solved. We don't have you can party until 3 a.m. and I can sleep. That, broadly speaking, is what sprawl does. It simply segregates whenever there's a conflict, and you just spread everything out. And but a second design strategy, which I think is what we do as placemakers, is we find mediations between those conflicts. So if you're partying until 3 a.m., maybe you and I agree to create a sound wall, or we put some tempered glass or soundproof glass or something like that. But we're not simply isolating ourselves from one another. We're still connected to one another through the public realm, through a kind of tissue of connections from the private to the public and back to the private again. And that is the kind of structure that ultimately is what cities are made of, this tissue of the public and the private. And that is this structure that approaches a just mediation between the conflicting freedoms that we have in the city. So I'll give you a more concrete example. This is a section of London, a little sort of montage picture there, around the corner from where I used to live. And it's very typical of a lot of cities. And what you'll notice if you look carefully is lots of different places that people can be in that space and spend time and so on, from the most public spaces out on the street to more semi-public and semi-private, and all the way to the most private bedrooms and so on and so forth. And then what you'll notice is that there's lots of connections between those things, between those different places. There are connections of movement when I can move down the street. There are connections of sound but not sight through the glass, for example, or sight but not sound through the glass, sound but not sight through the bushes, and so on. And if you map out this network of connections between these places, it's just an amazingly complex network structure that's going on, this tissue that's all around us, actually. And it extends from the most private room in your bedroom and so on, in your house, out to the most public spaces, the room-like spaces outside of the house, the yard, the stoop, and the area of the street that's in front of the house and so on. And all of those things, again, interconnected with one another in this complex tissue or complex network, and lots of ways that we can modulate those connections by opening windows and closing doors and doing little remodels and things that change that structure over time. And that, I think, is the essence of what placemaking actually is. And so you can see this gradual transformation happening over time. I went back after 5 years, and you can see in the picture below how, of course, there's been new owners and new paint jobs and signs and so on, but also new articulations of the spaces. So you can see up above there, they've built a new fence around their terrace, and then down below, they've got a couple of plants marking the entrance, and so on and so forth. And those are the kinds of transformations that are going on all the time. And over a longer span of history, you can see incredible transformations in places like Venice. Here's a famous Muratori plan showing the rather boring cadastral plan on the left, transforming into a much richer kind of tapestry, the city that we all know and love on the right. And that is what's going on, is these constant mutations and changes and adjustments by the individuals, by the co-creators of the city, not just the experts. And they're creating affordances, which means that we're at different scales able to connect, to exclude, to interact, and to enjoy the life of the city. And you can see this kind of self-organization going on. And I think we as designers need to accommodate that kind of self-organization. We need to design for self-organization, design to empower other levels of design and other levels of change and placemaking. And we need to accommodate this idea of biophilia, which is it's not just the large-scale physical relationships, it's also the small-scale physical relationships and the aesthetic relationships and the structures that we enjoy being around, the places that we want to walk to, if we want to walk to transit like the person on the lower right here. Those are all very important features as well. So when you think this way about urbanism, as about cities, you can see this kind of place network everywhere you look. This is just a typical Italian city. This is Pisa, actually. And you can see this tissue everywhere you look, and you can see how marvelously complex and rich and layered it is. And I think we as placemakers are people who come into these places and enrich them further and participate in that process. I think that's what placemaking is at its heart. So just wrap it up briefly and some time for questions. What went wrong? I don't think I need to tell you that we adopted a theory of what cities are that was very different from this kind of complex tissue. It was much more simple and linear, creating segregated uses, mechanizing connections, destroying that tissue, and that had profound consequences for how the city works and how the city's residents consume resources. You can see, for example, in a place like Amsterdam on the left, that the way people consume resources and emit greenhouse gases and so on is very different from the place on the right, which is the suburbs of San Antonio. And the choice architecture that people have, you can't walk or bike through that environment on the right. You have to be in a car, and if you're hungry, you're going to drive through, and so on. So this rationally segregated system has profound consequences. The capsule of our house and going to the capsule of our workplace, in the capsule of our car, and destroying the tissue of public space. But this was the model that everyone embraced of functional segregation, which, as we all know, was something that seemed like a great idea at the time and had profound consequences. The reformation of the 19th century city, the rationalization and segregation of Ebenezer Howard and Le Corbusier and the others, which really became the blueprint for sprawl. That you can see very clearly the relationship there and the fact that this is a profound impact on urbanism. Going back to the Athens Charter, many of you may know that document from 1933. It was actually published in 1943. Lots of elements of functional segregation, segregating traffic, demolishing older fabric, and so on and so forth. And this is the model captured in this wonderful drawing by Adolf Bayer. On the right is the messy, diseased, organic city. On the left is this wonderful, clean, orderly city. But the change in public space, the change in the way people interact with each other and in this tissue that I talked about is profound. So when you look at the Athens Charter and compare it to the new urban agenda, it's quite striking, as this paper with Seth Lowe that we're just completing, talking about segregation versus mixed use, segregating modes versus multimodal transportation, removing buildings versus aligning buildings and using them to enclose public space, demolishing historic structures versus keeping historic not only structures but also patterns. A top-down creation by specialists versus a co-creation, the city as a static work of art and engineering versus a complex adaptive system. And so these are the things that I think we right now are thinking about in terms of how we as placemakers respond to gentrification, respond to rapid urbanization, and the tools that we're going to be using. And some of these are not placemaking tools, some of them are economic tools, and we're not really talking about those here, but I just want to set that context that there are tools out there. We're using some of these tools in Oregon. There might be people talking a little later about business improvement districts and other kinds of structures that are allowing placemaking, inclusive placemaking, cities for all to go forward. So I think on that note, I'll conclude and simply point out that this idea of voodoo urbanism, of a sort of silver bullet approach to the economic challenges of cities is not going to work. It's fundamentally flawed. It's unsustainable. But if we think carefully about how to develop catalytic growth, how to use placemaking and build diversity, that can work. Thank you. So I've gone a little long, but maybe time for a couple of questions.
Hi there. Thanks very much for the presentation there. I'm Rosina Spinoa from BIDS, Business Improvement Districts, Belgium. Despite the accent, of course, I'm Scottish. I just wanted to know what your thoughts were when you go back and talk about voodoo economics versus something like the donut economics. I don't know if you've come across that at all from Kate Raworth.
Right.
Yep, where it's more about looking at money markets, taxation that are investing in the resources,
right,
and state-owned banks also creating these kind of public-private partnerships where they're working from the angle of, for example, the UN Sustainable Goals, Development Goals.
Right.
What your thoughts were on that?
Right. So Kate Raworth talks about the realm between the area of deprivation and the area of what she calls overshoot, or when you start to overuse your resources and deplete them. And that's very much similar to the Jacobs curve that I talked about before, where you want the sweet spot between the extremes. And I think what we're seeing with voodoo urbanism is a classic example of an overshoot. You're overheating the core of the city, and you're getting short-term benefits, but at a long-term cost that you're not paying. And that's another big theme I think a lot of people in this room are thinking about, a lot of us are these days, the externalities that are not part of our accounting these days, and that things like greenhouse gas emissions and gentrification and other things that are creating long-term costs that we're not paying yet. And the example from India is an example of that. Yeah, times are good right now, but watch out. If you overshoot, you're going to pay the consequences.
Joost Beunerman, 00 from London. You started out your presentation by asking a really interesting question, which, if I paraphrase well, was when are placemakers part of the problem and when are they part of the solution? To my mind, you didn't fully answer it yet, so I was wondering whether you could elaborate on that a little bit more. My own take on it is that in contexts of low demand and low capital availability, placemakers have often been part of the solution. And it's no surprise that after the global financial crisis, there was a huge upswing in that, and I think a lot of the interest across the room might have arisen in that period. But in contexts of extremely high demand in sort of global capital cities and increasingly cascading down to provincial cities, they're often part of the problem if they stick to their kind of hyper-local understanding of very small-scale interventions to do something nice and to do something that's worthwhile without understanding the bigger game they're part of and without, therefore, moving up from the hyperlocal to the strategic. Now, I'm really curious what your experience is where placemakers have successfully made that step to be part of the solution.
I think the point you make is exactly the right one, that we can't be simply upgrading spaces without understanding the broader context and working in response to the broader context. And I think that's really the theme of this conference in a lot of ways. And I didn't, come out and say, well, placemakers should do this, because I think placemakers should do a lot of things to be part of the solution, and placemakers could do a lot of things to be part of the problem. And I think we should be trying to unpack that over the next, day and a half. and talk about a number of things. Last night we were having a good conversation about how people who are leaving smaller cities and moving to bigger cities could perhaps be enticed to stay in these more affordable smaller cities if they had more opportunities there, if they had more local attachment to those places. And I think maybe we're going to talk about that in the workshop tomorrow afternoon. But that's one example of a number of strategies and tools and approaches that I think we can take. And so I just hope that over the next next day and a half, we'll be thinking about how placemaking and placemaking tools and strategies fit into that bigger context. Okay, great. Thank you.